We'd like to welcome you to another edition of What's Wrong with Our Economic Culture and all of the ways in which we're moving in the wrong directions morally and socially and culturally with our mainstream economic culture. Now, I'm Gary Russell from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, Anglican Diocese of Rupert's Land, and my co-host is Jody Knoll at the other end of the country in Newfoundland. Do you want to introduce yourself for just a moment, Jody?
My name is Jody Noel. I'm a fellow tertiary with Gary and our guest Sarah today. I live in Paradise in the Diocese of Eastern Newfoundland and Labrador. I'm about as far east as you can go because I'm on the eastern end of an island in the Atlantic, so you know. But I'm a parish priest, and I'm looking forward to this discussion today with our guest.
Now, some listeners and watchers may not know what tertiary means. Do you want to explain that?
Yes, a tertiary basically is somebody who has thought about and accepted the discipline of following Saint Francis, particularly the third order, which means we live with our families in the world, men and women, ordained lay, and we follow a Franciscan spirituality as a focus for life and discipline, and we do that together as a community dispersed throughout the world. There are Roman Catholic, Anglican, Lutheran, Ecumenical Franciscans.
Mm.
We're quite a varied lot. Because we're third order, we call ourselves tertiaries. Tertiary referring to third.
Okay, got it. And the other tertiary in this little group here is a friend of ours, well, Sarah Hartzell. We first, I guess, engaged together with a Zoom project that was called Walk With Us, in which we're looking at Indigenous issues. Sarah, say hello and then maybe talk about what that project was, Walk With Us, and what it was for and what you were doing.
Well, my name is Sarah Hartzell. I'm a third order Franciscan and Episcopalian. The Walk With Us program that I organized was, I think, 12 hours or so of Zoom conference time spread out over a week or two, with the idea of not only learning about, but in some ways experiencing and enacting the colonization story, primarily in the United States. And we divided up by geographical regions and examined those various stories.
That's a really good segue in what we're going to be talking about today, Sarah.
Well, how about that?
So the question of that is, what current projects has that led you into?
Well, I came home from that and not too much later started a group called Indigenous Allies, formed around basically the same idea, but looking at the local version of that story. So in Colorado, the big colonization event was the Sand Creek Massacre, which has its beginning place right here in Boulder, actually. I live in Boulder, Colorado. So that's where the Third Army was trained to go to Sand Creek and massacre Indigenous people.
How about if we just made a statement of what the doctrine of discovery is?
I just happened to have a quote. This is one, there were numbers of doctrines of discovery, 7 altogether between 1452 and 1914. And the quote is, it's the pleasure of Pope Alexander to invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans and other enemies of Christ, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery and take all their possessions and property.
That sounds kind of harsh.
Wow, that's that's the heaviest quote I've heard. That's
Well,
powerful. That's powerful.
that's kind of stands out to me. It's not very Christian.
No, even the
But
Pope
I
today
think
might agree.
that was the mindset at the time, and what was communicated through the doctrine of discovery is that these are enemies of Christ, pagans, and savages. That was the viewpoint. And that's one outcome, I think, of the manifest destiny. I'm sorry, manifest destiny was about the westward expansion in the United States, but with that same kind of mindset. So that and other aspects of it have woven their way into our culture.
Now, you said there were 7 of them. Did the ones following water it down or make it less harsh?
No,
No.
I haven't read them all. They're focused on different locations in the world, the west coast of Africa and different places that had not yet been
Yes,
conquered.
locally in my neck of the woods, our raison d'etre for Europe was the fishery. We
Mhm,
were, food supply for Europe, and
right.
with the fishery came eventual settlement, and with the settlement came the annihilation of the Beothuk people, who were the indigenous people on the island of Newfoundland. And the last person of Beothuk descent died in 1829, and that's lost to history. But we also have Mi'kmaq, Inuit, and Innu in our province, and they are still here. But the doctrine of discovery locally here just gave full ability to treat these people as something less than people.
Right. And ultimately, what we were supposed to do is convert them all to Christianity,
Right,
which led to a whole host of things.
right.
But at the beginning here, it talks about what has become the tradition of what I would call othering. That person has a different skin color or a different cultural tradition or whatever, and that makes them other and lead way for Christian superiority, white superiority, and so on.
So,
And go ahead.
so,
I just
so
want to say,
how does a church or faith community repudiate? Well, I mean, repudiate is a powerful word, but how does a faith community repudiate?
well, the Episcopal Church has done that. They've given the speech, even the Pope, the current Roman Catholic Pope, has given the speech about we repudiate this doctrine of
But what does
discovery.
that mean on the ground?
Well, that's the big question. The current quest in a lot of places is to reverse, dismantle, make structural changes. That's what I go for. I belong to an organization called Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery. And that work is all about doing just that and choosing particular project isn't quite the right word, but choosing places where the doctrine of discovery is still at work. And that's one of the things we've been digging into as Indigenous allies. We have a on the ground project with a court case between Apache Stronghold and the United States around Apache sacred land in Arizona. And Resolution Copper wants to come in there and build a copper mine, which the mining is done like underground. So eventually it creates a crater 2 miles wide, 1,000 feet deep. It would virtually destroy the whole place. So that has implications for environment, never mind destroying land sacred to the Apache people. And it's an example of what's come from Manifest Destiny and Doctrine of Discovery, which is profit motive. You know, we could sell that copper. They don't even sell it in the United States. You know, it's a foreign company, so it doesn't land up as money in the United States, but it goes out to that company in different parts of the world.
Sarah, are Indigenous allies self-professed, or are they recognized by Indigenous people? Because you've used the
Well,
word a couple of times, Indigenous allies. Perhaps you can just take a moment to say what that is.
well, it's the name of the organization. We we even have a website, Indigenous Allies. And that arose because when we first started, we invited Indigenous speakers. And one of them, we talked a lot about land acknowledgement. And in the course of developing that talk and that relationship, he called us allies.
Okay.
So the basic principle there with allies is you're in friendship, you're in right relationship, but you give up the notion of we know how to do this because we don't. We don't know what anybody else needs to do, never mind Indigenous people who have been so badly harmed by Americans.
I'd also like to talk about the property relationship and this Apache group that are fighting the development company. Who technically or legally owns that land? Is it the government? Is it the private company? Is it the tribe?
It's not the tribe. There is a reservation relatively close by for the Apache people. My understanding is that it's owned by the U.S. Forest Service. Over 10 years ago, there was this proposal on the part of the copper company to take over this land. And that was voted on favorably in one of those midnight deals in Congress, where there was something that had to get passed and they just tacked it on to that. So the Apache people have been fighting it ever since. It's been in court for 10 years.
I just recently saw a discussion in Canada on a related issue, and the question being discussed was why can't Indigenous people get mortgages on their reservations? And the answer was because the government owns the land. And so what
Right.
bank is going to give them a mortgage on land they don't actually own? And and that relates to the issue that colonialism has been a land grab where they were either driven out of or swindled out of their land.
Absolutely. That's happened all over North America, US and Canada. I actually have a short video that shows what the original territories were of tribes in the United States and how they were eventually taken over a period of time. It goes from like almost the whole country down to like 10% of that. So that was another outcome, I think, of Doctrine of Discovery, is that the concept of land as something to buy and sell came from that and denied the existence of the living, breathing, growing, green, delicious thing we know as Mother Earth. And the people of the earth who arise up and out of that become
And
nothing. It's commodity, buy it, sell it, transaction, that whole business.
there's a couple of aspects of that are occurring to me. One is the indigenous approach generally is land belongs to the creator.
Right,
And so we human beings cannot simply take it away from the creator and say, now I own that.
right.
And I think that's a pretty universal indigenous attitude about the land. The other part of it, the big part of the doctrine of discovery is saying that these savages are not using the land the same way we do, so they're not really using it. So we're free to take it over because they're not using it.
Yeah, it's the principle of terra nullius.
Hmm.
The land is empty. And if nobody claims this land and has sovereignty over it, then it's ours to take.
And that was because when the settlers came, indigenous people didn't really have the concept of private ownership.
Right.
Be, be,
That was a new thing.
and so my interpretation is that put them at an enormous disadvantage when it came to trying to negotiate with these people because they didn't have that concept to begin with. So it took a long time of figuring out these crazy people to figure out that they were trying to take the land.
Right. Right. You know, even in the story of Sand Creek, there were several treaties in Colorado where they were not properly negotiated because the people didn't really understand.
So, Sarah, the Episcopal Indigenous Justice Network,
Yes.
that sounds like a big, powerful lobby, or
Well, it's a handful of people right now. It's newly starting. Episcopal dioceses are involved in it, and the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery. It's a combined effort of those two things, wherein it's the coalition that's been fighting things like Apache Stronghold at the invitation of those people. That's another piece about allies. You know, you really don't have rights to be doing anything unless you've been asked to in some way. So Sarah Augustine is the executive director of the coalition. She's Indigenous herself and is like a mama bear fiercely fighting on behalf of her people. And Joe Hubbard is the co-convener, I guess, of that group. He's Episcopal priest. He's also on the group that's investigating boarding schools among Episcopal churches. And he's also on the presiding bishop's executive committee. So in my book, those are some pretty top drawer people. And that group, I can say we, because I'm part of it, is seeking to find places where doctrine of discovery has been misapplied and advocate for structural change. I think that's the main thing. If there's anything that needs to change, it's our social structures that have come out of doctrine of discovery.
Now, in your culture and in ours in Canada, there is very strongly a mainstream assumption that private property is the cornerstone of society. Everybody wants to have their own private house, and any corporation that has private property has the right to use it the way they want to because, property is God kind of thing. How might an allyship with Indigenous people that have a reverence for the land and consider it to belong to the Creator, how much inroads can you make there in a society that is so totally contrary to what you are pursuing?
Well, that's a good question. I and a few other people are naive enough to take it on and think we can make a difference.
Yeah, you have to be a little bit crazy.
Yeah, but it is a little nuts. I think our Franciscan values move us in the direction of reverence for the earth and a viewpoint of seeing all other creatures as kin. And I guess it's my philosophy that is if there's enough of those kind of people that are working in concert with each other and building community with each other from that point of view, then there's more and more of a basis for it if some stand up and say, don't do that. think that's one of the things that came out of Doctrine of Discovery is this whole business of individualism and entitlement. It's a big deal in some parts
So
of
it
the
seems
world.
like
So
doctrine of discovery has kind of, the fingers have woven themselves into more areas of our society and culture than in the indigenous life. It has actually woven itself into many aspects of our culture today that we accept a lot of things as so, that we need to start questioning a lot of things.
precisely. I belong to another group here called Adult Children of Manifest Destiny, which
Okay.
applies the 12 steps that have been used in Alcoholics Anonymous and so on. The 12 steps to begin to undo in ourselves those cultural things that have been shaped in us dating way back. So
Mhm.
in my book, there is a huge amount of internal work for white people to be doing as it relates to all of that. And honestly, that's kind of where it's at for me right now to look at those things and self-examine. That's a whole deal with Franciscans and take responsibility for that. Find ways, large and small, to repair those relationships.
Now, there's a sense in which we have to also ally ourselves with those people who are afraid of environmental destruction and thinking we have to be saving ourselves from self-imposed destruction. But such people often don't go any deeper than that,
Right.
and don't go into thinking how much I have to change in order to do that.
Mhm.
Is there work being done on these people, or are you talking to people who you can maybe get beyond just saving themselves?
In my book, it's a tricky thing because if you start to question white Christian, I have to say it, men, you start questioning the basis for their identity. So that makes it really hard to communicate enough love for them to begin to look at themselves. My part of the picture, as far as God's told me so far, is to connect church people. Obviously, the church is behind this whole thing and call on a deeper sense of our spirituality. And that would provide the framework for us to begin to take a look. But it's existentially threatening in some ways for us to look at ourselves and say, I caused this harm. Paradigm shift is how I think of it. And paradigm shift from this giant mess that we're in to the principles that you're articulating in your workbook, Gary, and to the mind that's shared by many Indigenous people. I think
Uh,
our Indigenous relatives have a huge amount to offer us. They've done the work of all these years of genocide and removal and land theft.
and
Somehow in the midst of that, there's people that are still here that have held on to that and
and
can and do make that available in many ways.
and people who know what Mother Earth really means. One thing I observe is a lot of these people that are merely environmentalists and just trying to save themselves, nonetheless, they have some receptiveness to the phrase Mother Earth.
Mhm.
The idea that the Earth is not just a pile of dirt that we use for resources, but there's actually it's part of one big family.
Right.
Yeah, and so my question, because I'm always trying to go after the people on the fence, who don't really know what they believe in, and how can they be drawn into deeper understandings of things. And I want to take this, yes, I know what Mother Earth means, and try to work with them to take them deeper. In what sense do you see not only all of the people and the animal, but the whole earth as our family, and that we have to treat our family with respect? And
Yeah. Yeah, I love that as an approach. You know, you ask about the people who have like zero openness. I don't think it's worth it to waste our breath on those kind of people, but there's some people that um, have maybe a little interest, and if they were better informed, might move along a path.
I notice in the information you gave us on the Episcopal Indigenous Justice Network, there's various references to links for different things. Under the Episcopal Resolutions on Doctrine of Discovery, there's one section after repudiation. It says reaffirm clergy training on Doctrine of Discovery. So is that like being retrained to preach against or preach for, or is it some other kind of training? Are you aware of any of that, Sarah?
No, I made that whole long list of resolutions, which sometimes don't go beyond just the resolution itself. The one that has moved forward and is being addressed by Episcopal Indigenous Justice Network is about boarding schools and providing forums where the truth can be told and repair and healing begin to happen there. The church voted a huge amount of money to that effort. And now there's a Episcopal commission that's working on that. They're on the ground working on that. So that's the one out of all those things that has come forward. I think there's one in there too about Apache Stronghold supporting that. Save Oak
Yep.
Flat is a piece of legislation that's pretty much stuck in federal lands subcommittee. But that'll be the next, that's the move in concert with the Supreme Court situation about that. So I think the rising tide and the Indigenous Justice Network is a sign of that, is that people are stepping forward to support some of these things.
in Canada, we call them residential schools, which you're calling
Yes.
boarding schools, but it's the same issue. And that reminds me of some, well, what's big in Canada is reconciliation.
Mhm.
That once we recognize the wrongs that have been inflicted on people, and once there's compensation, we have to start healing. We have to start bringing people together.
Right.
But I got a response from someone from Brazil, from the Amazon area, who said to me, "What do you mean reconciliation? They're attacking us. This is total war. We can't be reconciling with those people because they're attacking us. We're at war." And at first, I wasn't sure how to respond to him. But would the Apaches in Arizona say, "We can't reconcile yet. We're being attacked. We're at war"?
Well, I think they've focused the energy into fighting through the legal system, which is a way of resolving conflict, presumably. Doesn't mean it's fair, but you know, that's what we have. And legislation. Actually, I've heard another podcast about from two Indigenous people who were talking about the Indigenous view of Christianity and how Christianity in total has caused things like boarding schools, genocide, etc., the things we've talked about. So they want nothing to do with Christianity, you know, and even refer to the historic parts of the Bible, especially Hebrew Bible, where God gets mad at people and creates a big flood or, you know, kills a bunch of people. All that kind of violence is portrayed right there in the Bible. And that's what's been done to us. So why should we pay any attention to that?
So how should we reply to that?
You shouldn't. Jesus didn't do that. When I ask Indigenous people, how do you reconcile this business of Christianity and your Indigenous spirituality? One woman that I asked that of just said, Jesus would have nothing to do with the stuff we're talking about here, the doctrine of discovery stuff. Jesus had nothing to do with that. I'm here for Jesus to walk that path. And that's
And
what I say amen about, the whole structural, philosophical, theological thing of the church. It's there for a reason and it benefits. But the important thing is walking the path that Jesus walked, which Francis walked right behind him, which I seek to walk right behind him. So, yeah, if there's any answers, I think I call it original Christianity. What would Jesus do?
the first thing he did was go to the bottom of the pile, the people at the bottom of the pile, and identify with them.
Right,
And
right.
I kind of
Oh,
take Jesus as having not told me what theology to believe, but rather told me how to live
right.
and how to deal with people. I've had Indigenous people, but not in any hostile manner, but saying to me, "We think our spirituality is a cleaner spirituality. It doesn't have all the baggage that Christianity has." And so I'm going to stick with that. I'm not going to join the church. Part of my answer to them sometimes has been, yes, maybe so, but there still is common ground between us. Your idea of the Creator and our idea of God are really the same idea. And we should be looking for that common ground, or should we just be ignoring them and showing the path that we take?
Well, I think the core of it is love.
Mm.
God is love. So Indigenous people know about love. Things like family, community.
Well, we
So,
live in this hyper individual society where nothing matters but the individual, and community is kind of an aberration and something oppressive, and so we have to get the people of that side of the culture off of that aberration and start to get them understanding community.
right. I think our individual parishes can do that to be a loving community. And I think our fellowship groups among Franciscans can do that. Those are little pods of people that function as community.
I like to call them pockets of grace.
Yeah,
And if we can establish our pockets of grace and grow them to some extent and to get more people understanding that, I don't think, any revolution overthrowing any government is going to do it. It's going to be from the bottom of people learning grace with each other and learning community with each other. So,
right, right. Yeah, back to the question about allies and having that not be, we know the answer and we're here to help, but we don't, this is Sarah Augustine said, we don't want help. We want relatives. They see everybody as relatives. So what would if your brother's house burned down, what would you do? You might take him in, you might go help rebuild. That's a very different attitude from we're here to convince you that we've got all the answers. It's
because
a power differential thing. And traditionally, white Christianity has held the power and the money.
and sometimes have all the wrong answers.
But but
So in some
if you're
ways,
within that little bubble, everything seems normal. But if you live outside that bubble, or as some Franciscans do on the outside edge of the inside, there's another whole thing out there. That's what makes me hungry. That's what makes me want to explore, is there's a whole new way of being and living that's available to us.
And that's why sometimes I say it's going to take the indigenous people to save us. Thinking of the mainstream culture, because we're so far along in this ultra individualism and this consumerism that we can't get out of it without finding an example of how to live a different way. So that's what you're doing. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, actually, the Colorado Convention is coming up, Episcopal Church Convention in the Diocese of Colorado. Theme for that is, how do we do church in a different way?
So that's asking a fundamental question of who we are, because it depends on how we define who we are, then we can define who we are together. So it seems like we have a task ahead of us as a settler community, that we need to ask once again, who are we and what does it mean to be human, Christian? And all of us, because some of us don't have access to indigenous communities for conversation, but we can certainly ask, who are we and what does it mean to be human and what does it mean to be Christian? And so we're facing fundamental questions because we're speaking from a position of power. We're speaking from a position of, advantage.
Right.
And that's not where everyone is. That's not the position everyone is in. But sometimes we need to at least acknowledge that from a position of power and advantage, we all the more need to ask, who are we?
And be willing to give up some of that power that we hold based on our privilege. So a balancing out of who's got power.
So the church in Canada, the Primates World Relief and Development Fund have taken the initiative to do some work for Indigenous ministry in the wider church. You may be aware that in Canada, we have what's called a Sacred Circle, which is an Indigenous, self-governing Indigenous church within the Anglican Church of Canada. And that is forming and is taking on more and more of a firm identity with the new Indigenous Archbishop, Chris Harper, and it's moving forward in its growth and development. And I think that's fabulous. Added to that with the churches is that we are involved in reconciliation with the task force that was presented. It was 90 points for the task force on reconciliation. And most dioceses have some type of recognized official conversation occurring with Indigenous people. Even us, as far away as Newfoundland, we have appointed a canon for Indigenous advocacy, who's an Indigenous person who engages us to be involved in conversation. And that's the first part, is that we need to engage in conversation. But the Primates World Relief has one set up called The Land on Which We Stand, where they take you through an exercise to understand that the land you are standing on was at some point an Indigenous land that they no longer have, that they no longer control, that they no longer have access to. And that's been very helpful as well. I think all of these exercises and ministries are really important for us to engage in. In Canada, it will be different than the United States. We're two different countries. But a lot of the same white attitude is found in both countries. The settler attitude is very similar.
Yeah, thank you very much. Canada's way ahead of the United States in terms of doing all this stuff.
Well, we've also had great struggles to get where we are. I mean, it hasn't been easy for Indigenous people to get the country to be where it is. Part of what have helped us was the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms that was introduced in 1984 by the then Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. So what he called the founding nations of Canada, the English and French, would have recourse to settle disputes. So he patriated the Constitution. The Queen came here and signed it off and we took control of our Constitution. And then 5 million Indigenous people woke up and they said, excuse me, Mr. Prime Minister, the founding nations of Canada are not the English and French. They are the
Right.
Indigenous people. But because we passed the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, then we gave them recourse through the courts. And we're losing cases hook, line, and sinker in favor of the Indigenous people who are taking us to court
Mm.
because we have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which really helps the Indigenous people when they go to court. But
It's
when we passed it in the early 1980s, we didn't imagine that the Indigenous people would realize that they are Canadian citizens and can use the charter. And thank goodness they have been able to do that. We introduced the charter thinking of English and French Canada as being the founding nations, only to realize once the charter was passed, the Supreme Court had to recognize that the founding nations of Canada are not the English and French, but the Indigenous people.
okay.
Yeah, and some Indigenous people were willing to speak up and say, hey, this applies to us too.
Well, it was after the charter was passed, but yes, and it has been to their advantage to do that. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
great.
Hmm.
I say freedom and justice for all. All means all. No exceptions.
Sarah, I'm really glad to hear of the ministries and the work you're involved in locally in your area. And I think that it bodes well that the church is actively involved in those ministries and efforts for justice for Indigenous people.
Thank you. Thank
yes,
you. It's been great
yes,
adventure.
It's really important to be involved in that. And I think one of the things about the Franciscan order is that we want everyone to thrive in their time and place.
Right.
And that means that we encourage people to thrive as they discern that they need to thrive or would be challenged to thrive. And I think that's marvelous that you're doing this.
Yeah.
It's so important,
Well,
and I think Francis would be totally on board because our spirituality leads us to agree,
mhm,
100% there.
mhm.
And I think
when
the
you
efforts towards indigenous ministries in other parts of the province in Central and South America, it's so critical as well.
Right. Right.
when
Well, it's definitely a calling for me, and I can't explain it in terms of like I have Indigenous blood myself. I don't. And I'm thoroughly trained in the school of white settler colonist personality. But there's something in it that just has got me hooked and is drawing me forward. So I thank God
Yeah.
for that.
you sent me a video relating to your communications with the Apache in Arizona, and then I sent you back a video of Cree people in northern Ontario
Mhm.
working on similar issues.
Right.
And my question to you was, it's all the same cause, really. Are there more ways in which the Indigenous people in the U.S. and the Indigenous people in Canada can be working together?
That's a very good question. I really appreciate that. For Episcopal Indigenous Justice Network, I don't think there's any borders in that. So why not? You know?
Yeah, the part of my Indigenous lineage, which is mostly Ojibwe, extends right down to North Dakota and South Dakota and a whole lot of areas around the states. And so, in important terms, that border is really a political artifact, and it's really not relevant in a lot of ways.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, well, I'm a John Lennon person. Imagine there's no borders.
I
Yeah,
think that recognizing and affirming and communicating resources is helpful for us in our not just our Franciscan community, but in the Episcopal Anglican community to point out resources that are available to people, no matter where they live, that they can engage in conversation and learning and advocacy if that opportunity arises. So I think that's really important to continue to do that.
Well, we're working on the land acknowledgement for Diocese Convention. And with that, a virtual handout that talks about what a land acknowledgement is, why a land acknowledgement is not enough, and a whole long list of resources. So
we look forward to more conversations and more things to come from your group then. That's great.
yep,
Yeah.
we're on it about the resources.
Yeah. It would be good for us to maybe explore the possibility of conversations with people in Central and South America also to see what's happening there. As they say, I think they said to Gary in Brazil, we're under attack or we're under siege.
Mhm.
But it would be good to be aware of that conversation and that particular, area in their province.
Well, I'd be very interested in that because this colonization thing has happened all over and it's very alive in places like Brazil. Um,
We have a decolonization task force, I think, and I don't know how active it is, but it would be great if it could be more active to educate us,
Yeah, this is the Franciscan order that we're part of is just trying to set up a task force on decolonization. I think the problem we've had is it's such a big topic we haven't figured out how to narrow it down yet. And
Yeah.
so we're still at that sort of talking stage. Where can we go with this that is going to be effective?
Because decolonization also includes racial injustice
Well,
mhm.
and it's wide, very wide.
And environmental injustice.
The conversation is taking place again at the provincial chapter level, and I
it
think
is.
our minister provincial is more than happy to try to resurrect it. But maybe it needs to take focus or foci on just a couple of things at a time, because you can't eat a whole meal at once. You have to kind of take it in bits and pieces.
Right. It's like
Yeah.
eating an elephant. How do you do that?
Yeah.
One
So,
bite at a
Right.
time.
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
they have to set it up as a manageable project.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're struggling with right now. But I think if we keep at it, we'll do that.
But decolonization in Canada may not be the same as decolonization in Brazil in terms of time and place and specifics.
Well, I think the approach that the coalition to dismantle the doctrine of discovery has taken is find the things on the ground that are happening, like Apache Stronghold, find those things and support those efforts of Indigenous people rather than sort of, doing a structural, philosophical sort of thing. Just find some traction in the actual things that are happening. Because if you try to you sort out all what the issues are and how it happened where, you can do that for a really long time and
We're
still
tack-
not be on the ground with anything. So
we're we're trying to tackle some problems that are so unwieldy that they can be unmanageable. And so we have to do like you're doing, taking on a specific project on the ground and work up from there, I think.
yes, I think that to me, that makes all the difference in the world. And in the course of doing that, so say I take on Apache Stronghold as a cause, if you will, then in the course of communicating about that, organizing around, organizing people to support it, then all the educational and the naming of the issues, all that stuff happens in the course of doing that one specific thing. That's why we were very specific to do what we're doing.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. This has been great, Gary. Thank you.
Okay. And if either of you guys or Charlie or whoever from chapter wants to join this Indigenous Justice Network, come on down. You're welcome. Monthly meetings, second Tuesdays.
Maybe we can set up a chapter in Canada.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do in Colorado. So doesn't mean it can't happen.
So maybe we need to break it down into groups and sections to address some of that. There's food for thought down the road. This has been
Yeah.
a great conversation, Sarah. This has been marvelous, really.
Yeah.
Well, I'm having fun with you guys.
I told you it would be casual.
Yeah. That's great.
Thank you. This was marvelous.
Yeah,
Thank
this is
you.
great.
Thank you both very much.
Yeah, so we will end it here. For our listeners and watchers, this has been another episode. We're going to continue them with other themes related to this too. I'm looking for my rector in my parish in Winnipeg, Vince Solomon. I'm looking to having him on with us to discuss these issues too. So we have a whole lot we want to do. So thank you for listening and watching, and look on the list for the next time we do this. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
Thanks again, Sarah.